But you know, one of the things that we found as we watched those deals go through and we watched the assimilation of the acquired companies is, and a lot of times the companies are in different countries, is there are national cultural differences and there are company cultural differences. And a lot of times the company culture differences are stronger than the national culture differences. And you can, there's an interesting interplay, you know, that I think that, like we've done a lot of work in the telecom space with Nokia, which is based in Finland, RIM, the BlackBerry company, which is based in Canada, Palm and Qualcomm, which are based in California. And you know, you look at the company cultures in those companies, and it's very interesting. There are parts that derive specifically from the company, and then there are parts where you can see the national culture in the company. But it's not like a one-to-one mapping at all with the national culture, and there are some interesting departures where if you went in thinking, okay, well these are Canadians, so they're going to be like this, or these are Finns, so they're going to be like that, you'd be like 80% right, but the 20% you're not right is really an important 20% that could end up making it so that you shouldn't even do the acquisition because the company culture mismatch is so strong. And like one of the things Microsoft did, which I've never read in print, but which I think is very interesting, is when they set up their site in Hyderabad, India, they actually colonized it with Microsoft workers who were originally from India, but who had worked in Redmond and had basically gotten culturally assimilated in Redmond. So when they set up the Indian facility, it was originally staffed all with people who had repatriated from Redmond back to India so that they could establish the Microsoft company culture at that site in India. And that to me is fascinating. I mean, it really is a colonization, right? And most of the companies we've seen that set up offshore captives that thought doesn't even occur to them. And so they end up essentially institutionalizing a cultural mismatch by just hiring completely indigenously and maybe bringing over a few managers or something, but not really trying that hard to create the company culture on the other side. So, you know, it's interesting to me that I haven't read that published about the Microsoft experience. I think it's actually an important lesson. And somebody at Microsoft was really sharp to set it up that way.
You used a term that sounds rather mean, but I'm sure it has a valid definition. You said a captive, an offshore captive. I don't know what that means. It must.
It just means it's the same company. So as opposed to outsourcing where you've got a third party that's not part of your company, it means that they're part of your company. So if I'm Honeywell and I've got an offshore captive, that means I've got Honeywell Bangalore. They're Honeywell employees and I have to, you know, hire and fire them as Honeywell employees and support their professional development and stuff, as opposed to if I'm Honeywell and I make an arrangement with, you know, Infosys, and Infosys gives me a bunch of people, so the captive just means is they're basically my employees. It's not my term, that's just a comment.
Yeah, I'm sure it isn't.
Yeah.
So, I understand the top talent, that makes perfect sense, even just from a common sense perspective. But when you get top talent, you get very intelligent people, usually they're very opinionated and they're very strong-willed and certainly in a technical framework. What of the other factors do you think is the one or two that contribute most to bringing sort of this top talent together in terms of working together rather than just fighting and arguing and those kind of things?
Yeah, I mean, this is kind of an age-old question in software, I think, is, you know, what about all the gurus that are extremely bright but hard to work with or impossible to work with, don't work and play well with others? I think part of it is how you define top talent, and for my purposes at my company, we wouldn't hire somebody who was extremely bright and didn't want to cooperate with other people. That might be top talent for somebody, but it's not top talent for us. If you're a Microsoft, I think Microsoft will try harder. They'll get, you know, somebody who's, you know, legendarily uncooperative, but maybe just like, you know, the genius in the field. And so they'll find a way to, you know, make that guy work in the organization. And you know, there have been some good examples of that. So they've decided that differently than I have. On the other hand, they're trying to run a 100,000 person company. I'm trying to run a 20 person company, so the objective is a little bit different. I think that unless you're talking about people who are extraordinarily uncooperative, and I guess I differentiate between technical and business issues versus HR issues. If they're extraordinarily uncooperative, I think that's an HR issue, and I deal with it at the HR level. If you just haven't worked with them enough, then I tend to think that what makes people cooperate is alignment on the mission. So if you can get the mission clearly defined, communicated, get the buy-in, get everybody pointed in the same direction and wanting the same ultimate objective, I think that goes a long way toward minimizing the friction that you get. Then I think if you get that kind of buy-in, then the guy who is really running at odds with the rest of the team, you can actually deal with it at that level and say, hey, look, you know, the mission is this, your behavior is going this direction, which looks like it's more motivated by your personal goals than by the team's goals. And I just think that's a lot harder for people to get away with. So it's not going to solve every case, but I think that solves a lot of them. Yeah.
If you were going to try to turn the ship on an organization, which I'm sure you've done many times, what would you do? Start with something like mission or requirements, or like when you had the graph of the most, you know, like say you had a company that wasn't firing on any of these cylinders, what would be the first thing you'd start working with? It wouldn't necessarily be replacing the people, I wouldn't think. It would be some other aspect of management
How about
education.
number 5?
Yeah, I mean, so we work with dozens of companies a year on a consulting basis. We almost never recommend staff replacement. You know, there is a case maybe once every 2 or 3 years where a client will say, we're not really sure that our architect or our VP development, or somebody like that is the right person. Can you please comment on that? And we will when we're asked to, but otherwise we really try not to. The details vary an awful lot. You know, in terms of improving organizational effectiveness, we find what a lot of other published reports have found. Requirements is a really common issue. That is not, and that goes to your question, not really being close enough to the customer, trying to guess what the customer wants instead of actually learning, talking to the customer enough about what the customer wants. And that can run pretty deep in organizations. Sometimes nobody's talking to the customer. Sometimes the product people are talking, but the developers, the technical staff isn't allowed to have direct access to the customer. So there's too strong a filter on what's coming in. And sometimes you just don't have enough customers that you have access to. I mean, it really, you know, it can be just about anything. We've seen cases where the vision isn't being communicated clearly. The executives will know what the vision is, but they're just not, you know. We had a meeting last month with a firm in New York where the top executive, it was very classic in our experience where the technical staff was not getting the vision, and the CEO's point of view was, look, you know, it seems like I've communicated this like every quarter, and the technical staff just, you know, doesn't get it. And from my vantage point, it's like, well, every quarter is nowhere near good enough. I mean, the companies that we see do this well are doing executive brown bags on more like a monthly basis. I mean, especially if there's a problem they're trying to correct. You know, one of the things that I saw at Symantec that I didn't mention is that when they look for a program manager, or in Microsoft terms I think would be called a program manager, they have identified something that they call a hyper-communicator. And their definition of a hyper-communicator is someone who, under stress, their natural tendency is to communicate more. And that a lot of technical staff are not hyper-communicators. Under stress, their tendency is to withdraw and communicate less. And so they found that in that program manager role, you don't want people who go dark when they get in trouble. You want people who reach out and try to get help and let other people know what's going on. So I don't know, that lack of communication, vision communication in particular, is common. That's one of the reasons I have it in this presentation. Not communicating the sense of mission, I think, is pretty common.